Good afternoon, everybody who's here in Asia. Good morning to people joining us from Europe and indeed from the US as well this morning. I'm Chris Humphrey, Executive Director of the EU-ASEAN Business Council. Welcome to this, our first webinar of 2022. We all hope, of course, will be a much better year than last year. Today, we are looking at ASEAN in 2022, the economic outlook and drivers for growth. I have with me a very esteemed panel. We have with us His Excellency Dr. Marty Natalegawa, who's the former Foreign Minister for Indonesia. He's also, amongst other hats he currently wears, a member of the UN SecGen's High-Level Advisory Board on Mediation. We have Joseph Nkakatera, who's joining us this morning from a very early in the morning in New York, where he's currently stuck. Joseph is the Chief Economist for ASEAN for HSBC. We have Dr. Sweta Saxena, who is the Chief for the Macroeconomic Policy and Analysis in the Macroeconomic Policy and Financing for Development Division at UN-SCAP, based in Bangkok. And then we have Andrew Naylor, who's the Regional CEO for Asia Pacific, excluding China, and the Global Head of Public Policy at the World Gold Council. Good afternoon to all of you. Thank you for joining us. We are today, as I said, looking at ASEAN's prospects for this year. I think we're all aware that ASEAN is beginning to bounce back from the pandemic. It has very high vaccination rates across many of its member states. I was in Cambodia last week, which has an astonishingly high vaccination rate there. The region is beginning, as I said, to show some signs of recovery. There's an apparent strong desire to focus on sustainable growth, digitalisation, renewed promises to achieve economic integration. And of course, there is growing consumption amongst its middle classes, which itself is a growing segment in ASEAN. I think it's fair to say that while some forecasts, though, were optimistic, others remain cautious. And of course, we never know quite what other curveballs the coronavirus is going to throw our way. And we'll try and, at this webinar, to dive into some of the issues around that. You know, what truly is the outlook? What are the economic trends that we can see for businesses in the region? Does ASEAN's economic and investment outlook make the region an attractive area for investments? What are the growth levers that ASEAN should prioritize moving forward? And indeed, how can ASEAN leverage on its external relationships to help with recovery? We are recording this webinar. If you would to ask questions in the audience, please use the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen so that we can get your questions from there, and we will try and pose them as we're going through the webinar. I'm going to start off for my panel this morning. Or this afternoon, sorry. I'm going to give them a very gentle, easy opening question and ask them to try and tackle it in turns. And we'll start with Joseph for it, please. And the question is, how do you see the prospects for economic recovery in ASEAN this year? What could derail it and what can spur it on?
Thank you, Chris, for that question. And hello, good afternoon, good morning, everybody. I think from a numerical perspective, the growth numbers will be very good in ASEAN this year. You will see this bounce that we've been expecting, at least from last year. And that's simply because I think last year there was a lot of misplaced expectations about the virus, especially going into the summer. We weren't prepared for the Delta wave. There was this expectation that, the worst had passed. While I think now, policymakers are a bit more realistic. They understand that COVID is not going away. The countries that were sticking to at least a zero COVID or close to zero COVID policy last year, Thailand, Malaysia, Singapore, they've abandoned those, Vietnam, of course, as well. So now just about every single ASEAN country has publicly come out, had a shift of strategy. They're viewing it as endemic. They're going to live with COVID. And that's going to allow them to be much more flexible with their policy actions. And of course, they're going to ensure that ICU occupancy remains low. They're going to look at some key variables. But by and large, it's very clear that we're not going to see the same lockdowns that we saw last year. I don't think there's a political appetite nor the economic capacity actually to have that again. So I think simply put, there will be a strong recovery. We have to, however, put that in the context of what's happened in the last 2 years, the really bad growth numbers, the structural impact of the crisis. So even if you have a very good year for a country like Philippines, for example, it's still going to take a few quarters until we get to pre-pandemic levels of output, which is, still quite a sad reality that reflects quite a significant development setback as well. And a country like Thailand, for example, tourism is simply so important, so large, that's not going to recover for a while. So that will limit the ability to get back to pre-pandemic levels as well. So in short, yes, we'll see that recovery, but we need a little bit more of a nuanced view, I think.
Thanks, Joseph. Very succinct. Dr. Swether, your point of view.
Thanks, Chris. Actually, thanks for asking me. And actually, Joseph covered a little bit of it, what I would have said. Yes, last year, the economic growth did pick up. It was, from our estimates, we actually think that it was about 2.2% from a -1 in 2020. And a lot of it was coming definitely from the base effects, basically, too low of an output. Some of the things Joseph just mentioned actually are going to be coming true. I mean, like, people are sick and tired of COVID, and they're going to learn to live with COVID. So we're not going to see very stringent lockdowns and stuff like that, which is going to help in recovering a little bit faster. So we are thinking, I mean, like, although this will be revised a little bit, given a little bit more optimistic fourth quarter numbers, we are thinking growth might be about 2% actually for this year and next year. But what gets lost a little bit, and I wanted to actually mention that because Joseph mentioned about growth being up, and maybe it will take a couple of quarters before we go back to the pre-pandemic levels. So I just wanted to add that no matter how fast we grow, unless and until we grow really fast, we are not going to go back to the pre-crisis trend level. The trend at which output was growing, and that is always the biggest concern with any shock. My own research has shown, and actually, I mean, like, from different angles, look at whichever shock you take, an economic or a non-economic shock. So we've estimated, according to the growth numbers that we have seen and what we are predicting, from a period of 2020 to 2023, there's going to be a permanent output loss of about $900 billion, okay, for this ASEAN region. And just to put this number in perspective, we had done 3 years ago a study where we were looking at our flagship report, produced the numbers of how much additional investments are needed in order to achieve the 2030 agenda, to achieve all the SDGs. And that number was in the ballpark for ASEAN. I'm talking about ASEAN here, not for Asia Pacific in general, was about $200 billion. So think about additional investments needed per year was $200 billion. And here, just because of the pandemic, they're going to be losing about $900 billion. So think about how it actually sets a region back. And I think, yes, COVID, we're going to learn to live with it. I think that's one. But another, let me actually put it looks a little bit positive, but one of the other risks actually is that they don't have enough ammunition in their fiscal, ammunition in fiscal power, basically, to grow out of the economy by just simply spending, because a lot of these countries had spent a lot actually during this pandemic in the stimulus packages. Like Singapore itself did about 18% of GDP package, and I think about Thailand did another 15% and stuff like that. So that's where these guys are going to face a little bit of constraint going forward. So how to deal with that? And big challenge for this year coming for these countries, because Joseph didn't mention, and that's why I'm going to mention this. The two other challenges actually. One is when interest rates are going to be going up in the US, quite confirmed in March, which can see an outflow of capital from this region, which means depreciation of currencies, which could also feed into prices and inflation, which have been very contained so far. But the other part is actually that if they have foreign currency denominated debt, depreciation of currencies is going to have a harder time sort of, serving those debts. Again, on this one, I think so far, the percentage of the debt in foreign currency is much low, basically, so it doesn't seem like a problem. But we all know when a panic starts, actually, investors can't distinguish between liquidity issues as well as solvency issues, so things can actually go out of hand. And the last thing I wanted to say was China. China is not in the region, but whatever happens in China could have an impact on this region. Just to be on a lookout, basically. China, with its big structural changes of trying to go, net zero by 2060, let's have common prosperity, trying to tackle their property boom and all these kind of things. That could lead to a slowdown in China. And slowdown in China means actually a slowdown in these economies through trade channel. That's the main one. But the other channel is a lot of in tourist economies, especially an economy like Thailand, where lots of tourists come from China, could also be a problem. So just to keep that at the back of your mind, that these are some of the downside risks which we see, but it looks pretty positive for this year so far. Thank you.
So Andrew, did you agree with Joseph? He says there's more realism, that the abandonment of zero COVID policies means we should be a bit more optimistic, or are you also seeing some downside risks?
Well, I think I don't want to repeat, what the previous two speakers have said, because I agree with all of that. But I do though think that the key issue, there are a number of key issues. There are a number of sort of structural changes, longer term changes that are going to have an impact. But I think the key uncertainty for me is, are we really going to start living with COVID? That's the talk, but I'm not sure that governments across the region will necessarily walk that walk. Forgive the sort of bit of a cliche. And I think the key issue will be whether there is an emergence of a new variant that perhaps either escapes the vaccine or is sort of Omicron plus, if you like, and whether really we will learn to live with it, or whether risk tolerances will be really pushed to the limit. So I think that's the main major immediate headwind that I see. But certainly in terms of the outlook, we're definitely seeing a consumer-led rebound. As Dr. Sweta mentioned, the capacity of governments to continue stimulating the economy is really, really very challenged. As was said, Singapore is around about 18% of GDP. We've seen that in many other countries. And that the knock-on effect of that is obviously we're heading into this higher interest rate environment. We're going to continue to see a bit of a tug of war, if you like, which is particularly acute for the gold industry in particular. But this sort of tug of war between interest rates and the interest rate outlook and inflation, I think that's going to continue for the foreseeable future. But in terms of the longer term trends that we're potentially seeing that are going to have an impact, first of all, diversification of supply chains. This is COVID was a bit of a catalyst for this, but it's not something that's just limited to COVID. I think globally we are seeing a reevaluation of supply chains, not necessarily from a protectionist stance. It's not about protecting jobs or local industry in the way that it perhaps was in the past. It's more about securing access to vital supplies. And the catalyst was obviously PPE during the COVID crisis, but actually governments around the world now looking at other strategic industries, the battery industry, for example, access to semiconductors. And there's a concern about over-reliance or a concentration of production. And what we're seeing is governments now not necessarily always trying to repatriate production, although that sometimes is what's happening or will happen. But you're also seeing governments looking at alternative sources of supply. And the one region I think that would benefit the most from that, certainly in the immediate term, is this region, ASEAN. And I think we'll continue to see in the longer term that sort of regionalization of supply chains that I think will benefit this region potentially more than others. And then the final point I would make is geopolitics. Not just here, but there are a number of potential geopolitical flashpoints around the world, and that's going to really be on the horizon for quite some time. Won't talk specifically about gold, but obviously gold is impacted perhaps more than other industries when it comes to both the interest rate and inflation environment and geopolitical risk that's potentially on the horizon. But in summary, I think we are seeing a consumer-led demand rebounding. That is continuing, but there are some headwinds and uncertainties. One, I'm not quite sure that we're definitely going to learn to live with COVID. I think risk tolerance is still lower than it perhaps should be. So I think that's going to be a challenge. And then in the longer term, this diversification of supply chains, which I think is actually the bigger, one of the bigger opportunities for this region in the longer term.
Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Taligawa, let me bring you into the conversation. I'd like to hear your viewpoints on where you think ASEAN's prospects are for this year. And perhaps you might want to touch on some of the geopolitical issues, both within ASEAN and indeed between ASEAN and its external partners.
Thank you very much indeed. And I do share the views and expressed earlier just now, and which I don't wish to repeat. Just a couple of points, if I may. Obviously, when one speaks of ASEAN as if as a collective entity within the region, there is clearly a fair degree of differences in the nature of the economies concerned. Probably there is as much that differentiates our economies than one that is common to us. And naturally, therefore, while we speak of an ASEAN almost as a monolithic entity, as a matter of fact, when we look at the specific conditions of the economies of ASEAN countries, there are unique circumstances to be faced by each of them. One thing, while I don't disagree as well with the overall sense of optimism that there are signs of the ASEAN economies bouncing back, one footnote that I wish to put is the idea of how inclusive the recovery would be, because we speak of macro numbers, obviously, but the impact of the pandemic of COVID have not been equal to different segments of the societies in ASEAN economies. Some have been more severely affected than others, and I assume the recovery, once it does take place, may not necessarily bring everyone, to improve everyone's situation, most people's situation. So I would be wanting to ensure, or wanting to be looking at the quality of the growth itself, to what extent the notion of recover better or grow back better can be materialized, because there are still vulnerabilities and fragilities to be found in different segments within the national economy. And while we focus obviously on the strength of the consumer class, the middle class, so to speak, there are elements within the society that have been more severely affected by the COVID than others. On that note as well, the different degree of exposure to the external factors are different between the ASEAN economies. Obviously, a country like Singapore will be far more integrated and exposed to international development than, for instance, Indonesia's economy, that is a bit less exposed to external developments. Having said that, at the same time, there are external events or developments that are outside the control of most governments in the region, to which they have to respond. The geopolitical risk is an obvious one. The US-China one is, in a way, the easiest to anticipate, because it's a known unknown in a way, although it has become even more multifaceted and ever more complex. But there are other geopolitical dynamics out there that we must bear in mind. For instance, the situation between India and China. These are two economies not without significance to many ASEAN economies. I've done some study for the central bank in Indonesia that looks at Indonesia economy's exposure to geopolitical tensions. And certainly we have discovered that it is not only US-China that we must bear in mind, but also other geopolitical dynamics as well. But having said that, I don't wish to be too overly pessimistic. I see beyond the COVID-related improvements, I see some excitement in terms of the digitalization of the ASEAN economies in a way that can propel the economies of our region, and actually, if done right, can be inclusive in nature as well, because in a way, it can level the playing field to some of the even small and medium enterprises that hitherto have not had global access. Through digitalization, they can actually make that shortcut and have access to the global market. My final point as well, if I may, is the RCEP, the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership that had come into force earlier this month. I'm somewhat, I was about to say despondent and unhappy the fact that Indonesia, which is the initiator of this idea back in 2011, is actually a laggard. We are yet to ratify, to my knowledge, the RCEP. Hopefully that will be done soon. So, but that's a very positive development, and I gather that Singapore as well has recently entered into force a free trade agreement with the Pacific Alliance. Again, important propellant potentially for the region's economy. Thank you.
Thank you. You just stole a question from me. I was going to ask you about RCEP in Indonesia, but you've already answered it. So thank you for that. Joseph, I'll come back to you at this point, and please, others jump in. I mean, Andrew mentioned diversification of supply chains. Dr. Taligawa there talked about the differences that exist in the economies in the region, and therefore the rates they can recover. Do you actually subscribe to the view that ASEAN's well placed for taking advantage of supply chain diversification? And if so, which markets do you think can take advantage of it? I know there are lots of concerns, certainly amongst our members, about localization requirements in places like Indonesia.
Yeah, look, I do subscribe to the argument. I think it is still happening, and it's been happening for quite some time. I mean, I think the seeds for this were laid even before the U.S.-China trade war, when wage rises in China were really quite significant, and ASEAN was really benefiting on a wage perspective. And then it just accelerated during the U.S.-China trade tensions, and it actually has accelerated in some ways even further during COVID. Of course, FDI flows globally have fallen very sharply, but they've fallen less in ASEAN, and in countries like Vietnam, Malaysia, Singapore, and even Indonesia, actually, there's been, according to some metrics, an acceleration of FDI intentions during the pandemic. Now, I think a lot of that has to do with the fact of what ASEAN was producing. We know that ASEAN plays a very key role in the semiconductor supply chain. Even, a country like Malaysia, which isn't really known to many in the West, actually is probably the world's largest producer of finished automotive chips, but there's a chronic supply shortage. And if you have to increase supply quickly, you have to go to the producers that are already established. Even the Philippines, right, plays a significant role in packaging of these chips. So, I think a lot of semiconductor companies have doubled down on ASEAN, given they already had supply there. It's hard to expand production in China, given some of the geopolitical tensions. So ASEAN just clearly benefits there. So I think Vietnam is a great story as well, because even though last year was very difficult from a lockdown perspective, labor shortages, you see that high frequency FDI data has held up. So it shows that there is a degree of confidence in the region. I think it's good that policymakers have shifted to kind of a more flexible COVID policy sooner rather than later. And I think that ASEAN really continues to benefit in terms of its share. Now, it's a different story in different countries. Indonesia, you mentioned, historically relatively low FDI inflows as a share of GDP. But Indonesia has seen a pickup in the last few years, and that's due to multiple things. On one hand, it's this nickel supply chain really trying to benefit from the EV story, partly done by somewhat, let's say, protectionist trade policies, really not allowing raw mineral exports. But that's actually worked out to Indonesia's benefit because you have seen this value add being done there. And then with the omnibus law, even though there's been a setback, with the constitutional court reading, it's still, most of it stands in place, and it should bring in incremental inflows. I would be a little bit more concerned in countries like Philippines and Thailand. They really haven't attracted the same FDI during the pandemic. I think that's partly because, the impact was very large. There's also been some lingering political uncertainty in both countries. I think especially in the Philippines, it took really quite a lot of time to finish the tax reform changes. And then now with the kind of the presidential race, there's a concern with some candidates perhaps come back to maybe more protectionist policies. So we need some of that political uncertainty to clear. And maybe that will help the laggard economies from an FDI perspective catch up. But by and large, I still subscribe to the ASEAN kind of manufacturing FDI view.
Thanks, Joseph. Dr. Sweda, would you agree with that? And perhaps when you're thinking about that as well, digitalisation has always been figured as one big area to boost the economies of Southeast Asia. But can they really take advantage of the digital economy going forward? And also, I'll pick up on the point that Dr. Taligawa mentioned on RCEP. Do you think RCEP's a game changer for ASEAN, for its growth?
Okay, so thanks, Chris. Actually, one thing I wanted to actually pick up, I personally think that one thing, before I go into the questions that you posed, sort of, Dr. Marty's thing about this whole how inclusive the recovery is going to be. actually, and that's a big problem for a region like Asia Pacific in general, and also ASEAN in particular, also with so many people got affected actually during the COVID pandemic. A lot of people that got affected were basically informal workers that were outside of the network, so to speak, official sort of networks that had any help from anywhere. So anyway, so building an inclusive recovery is a challenge actually. Okay, and for this year's report that's going to come out in March, actually we are working on this challenge, how to actually make the recovery more inclusive, by the way. So you'll find out a little bit more at the end of March what our views are on that one. But coming to this whole digitalization and everything, I wanted to actually bring it from a macroeconomic perspective, basically, given that we had this pandemic and it actually required people to work from home. I think we are all getting used to working from home through this, through the medium that we are just now chatting, schooling from home and all sorts of things. So we think that there is a lot of room for all these countries to actually invest in digital infrastructure in general, actually. So just to give you a sense, in our last year's report, given we were working on how to build inclusive, green, and resilient economies, we proposed a policy package. Okay, it was a full policy package where we called it building forward better instead of building back better, because we didn't think we wanted to go back to the same days pre-COVID because they weren't very good, at least in my opinion. So we called it building forward better package, and it had 3 components. A social component, which would provide actually healthcare and social protection. It had a digital component, which means investing in infrastructure, digital infrastructure, and providing education. And it had a green component, which would mean that you transition towards renewables from energy transition and working on your climate actions and biodiversity, and giving up all your fossil fuel subsidies, as well as having a carbon tax as low as $40 actually we had assumed in that one. What we found, if you look at the Asia Pacific region, of course, it's a huge game changer, basically, if you do this, but it depends on how much investments are you putting in. So we had 2 different investment levels. One was actually ambitious level, which means you really want to achieve the 2030 agenda by 2030. And then there was a business as usual, which meant certain percentage of your ambitious level, which is about 40%. Based on your previous spendings and all the kind of resources available. But just to give you a sense for this region, ASEAN region, we had done the calculation where in the next 20 years, basically, if you actually implement this kind of a package where you have a social program and a digital package and as well as a green package, you're going to lift about 30 million people out of poverty compared to a baseline scenario. Your carbon emissions are going to go down by 30%. By 2040, inequality is going to go down, and your air quality is going to improve. All these benefits that are going to happen are tremendous. Now, there's going to be a cost. Of course, you need the money, and in our last year's report, actually, we suggest lots of ways of financing different things. Basically, if anybody is interested, they can go and look into it. But this is how we are thinking, actually, that building a digital economy is the way to go anyways. So they really need investments in that one. And RCEP is a game changer. I kind of want to pass on that one. I think it could be. I'm never too sure about these kind of arrangements per se. So I'll just pass on that one for now.
Okay, I think the key on RCEP is how it's implemented, and we have to wait and see how that one comes. And you can all comment on my thoughts on that shortly. Andrew, I think yesterday the IMF came up with some downgrades for the outlook for the global economy going forward, based largely on inflation rates and also on the prospects for rate hikes coming certainly from the Fed and probably in Europe as well. Perhaps you can give your thoughts on how that might impact this part of the world, and indeed perhaps the role that gold can play in helping with macroeconomic stability and protecting against currency volatility, which unfortunately Southeast Asia has a history of currency volatility.
Thanks, Chris. Yeah, I mean, in terms of the role of gold in macroeconomic stability, there are 2 points I think I would make. One, or two sort of lenses. One is sort of the institutional lens, including the official sector. And if you look at demand for gold, about 17% of annual demand for gold comes from the official sector, i.e. central banks, who view it as a component, a strategic component of their reserves. And there are a number of reasons for that. Without getting into too much detail it. I mean, it's a very liquid asset. So on average, about $145 billion of gold is traded every single day. And that makes it more liquid than some other major asset classes. Not the most liquid asset, but it's certainly a very liquid asset. And you need that kind of liquidity in times of crises. And what's interesting is if you look at the gold price during the financial crisis of 2007, 2008, what actually happened is, and it began to challenge people's thinking on gold. What happened is in the early part of that crisis, the gold price actually went down, and it went down because a lot of institutions were selling it, i.e. they were realizing or unlocking that liquidity. But as the crisis continued, the price started to go up again as we were over the worst, and in gold's sort of longer term role as a risk mitigator and as a safe haven asset sort of came to the fore. So it plays a role in macroeconomic stability from a reserve management perspective. In ASEAN, the component of gold, or the gold component of reserves, tends to be lower than, say, in Europe, North America, and Japan. That's partly because of legacy reasons. But if you look at who's been buying gold in the last year from the official sector, Thailand was the biggest buyer. Last year, it's taken their reserves to about 250 tons. Singapore bought gold, or the MAS bought gold for the first time in, I think, about 21 years last year. So certainly central banks recognize its value as a safe haven asset and as a store of wealth. And you're talking about currency volatility, which has been an issue in ASEAN in the past. Actually, ASEAN is a huge market for gold on the retail side. So Indonesia, Thailand, Vietnam in particular are very large gold demand centers from a consumption point of view, not really on an institutional investment point of view, but from a consumption point of view. And we've looked at all markets, but just looking at Vietnam, which is where we completed our most recent research, we found that 72% of consumers in Vietnam have invested in gold, but only 36% have a current or a savings account. And when we looked at why, some of the top reasons were that it was considered a safeguard against political and economic uncertainty. 79% believed it was a good safeguard against inflation and currency fluctuations and so on. So it's not just institutions that recognize the role that gold can play potentially as a macroeconomic stabilizer, but individuals as well have often used it to protect wealth. Final point I would make is on interest rates and on inflation. And I mentioned earlier that there is this sort of tension, if you like, between interest rates and inflation, a bit of tug of war. When interest rates are high, the simple view is when interest rates are higher, the opportunity cost of holding gold goes up because gold doesn't provide an income, and you find that in a higher interest rate environment, institutional demand in particular, goes down for gold. But conversely, in an inflationary environment, interest goes up because inflation or gold is considered one of the hedges against inflation. There are other hedges out there, but it's considered one of the hedges against inflation. Actually, if you look at the research, we've done quite a lot of research, and if you have a low inflation environment, so by that we mean 3% or less, gold historically, and when I say historically, I mean since 1971 when the US came off the gold standard, gold has performed on average at about 7%, or appreciated on average by about 7% every year in a low inflation environment, so 3% or less. Conversely, not conversely, but contrasting that with a high inflation environment, which is above 3%, the average annual return in that kind of environment is about 14%. So the data does suggest that gold certainly historically has been an effective hedge against inflation, and that's borne out in the data, the historical data, but also when I mentioned the perceptions research that we've done in Vietnam, and we've done that in Thailand as well. We've done it globally, and a common theme that comes up in terms of the individual rationale for buying gold. One of the reasons has been to protect against inflation, against currency volatility, or even in worst case scenarios, currency devaluations. So So it was a bit sort of gold-centric, but certainly this year, linking it back to the economic outlook we were talking about, where interest rates, inflation are going to be a big, perhaps competing dynamics. That's both a tail and a headwind for gold, but certainly in an inflationary environment, we'd expect that to be quite supportive of gold. But in the longer term, I mean, its primary role, or one of its major roles, is as a hedge against risk, and we certainly believe that will continue, and that gold can contribute to macroeconomic stability.
Thanks, Andrew. Dr. Tanagawa, I'll come to you. I'm going to try and link two things together in this question. I mean, ASEAN's attractiveness for foreign businesses has always been pretty well known, and pre-COVID at least, ASEAN was a very large destination for foreign direct investment, one of the largest in the world, and indeed outstripping China. I think going forward, building forward better, to take Sweta's comment, which I actually rather like. I think climate change, carbon neutrality, sustainability issues going to come more to the fore. Traditional large blocs that are long-standing partners of Southeast Asia, like the EU, coming up with more and more legislation around sustainability issues, the need for green supply chains, etc., etc. How do you see this playing out politically within the region? Are the governments here ready to really move and back up their commitments made at COP26? And do they understand, do you think, the need to do so to ensure that FDI keeps flowing?
Well, first of all, an interesting footnote as well is that during the recent COVID situation, the intra-ASEAN investment actually have gone up. I think this is a rather interesting phenomenon that whilst overall, obviously, foreign direct investment to the ASEAN economies have declined, but the proportion of foreign direct investment intra-ASEAN has actually gone up. So at least the ASEAN economies in the investment domain are becoming ever more enmeshed and more integrated, and hopefully that's a trend to be further enhanced in the years to come. I mean, it seems to me politically now there is greater recognition amongst decision makers in the ASEAN economies that the pathway or the road ahead is one where issues of sustainability, ESG, for want of a better term, is going to become even more important in the investment decisions in the private sector and even in interstate relations. And certainly we are beginning to hear governments, including in Indonesia, saying all the right things in terms of recalibrating and refashioning its economy in line with that type of vision. How that will play out, I think, is something that will be quite interesting to witness to what extent there is to be any gap between announcement or aspirations and reality. Because, for instance, Indonesia's reliance on coal as a resource for it to drive its economy is well known. And when you have economies such as China and India, two major export destination countries for Indonesia, refashioning its economy away from fossil fuel, then it will impact already for Indonesia in terms of its exports, let alone Indonesia's own changing energy mix. So the short answer, I guess, to your query, to your question, is that I think politically now there is a greater recognition, but we are yet to see whether such a recognition will actually be, to what extent it will be manifested in actual concrete policies and programs ahead. But certainly there is a greater recognition nowadays on ESG and sustainability issues.
Thank you. Quite significant about there. Joseph, you're leaning forward. I'm going to come straight back to you on this one. I mean, from your point of view, how important do you think greening of economies is going to be for sustaining a longer term economic growth of Southeast Asia compared to other regions?
Yeah, I think it's very important. I mean, not only from the perspective of course, improving local air quality and, of course, contributing to this global movement, but even for strategic reasons, right? So, for example, take Indonesia, right? Significant coal usage is actually increasing quite sharply on the back of kind of the PLN's power plant projections. But actually, if you want to become a key producer for EV battery materials, right? A lot of producers, especially foreign companies in the West, are really going to look at the carbon footprint of the country and how electricity is being derived. So if you're producing key components for EV batteries, but those components are being used with coal-fired electricity, it makes it very difficult to sell that to investors. And I think that might have been one of the reasons why this big supposed Tesla investment in Indonesia never really came through, because of some of these concerns. So a lot of times, there's a strategic interest for this as well, given the global movement. I think even from a purely economic perspective, right, we know that new capacity in solar, wind, geothermal in just about every country now is cheaper actually than coal, or at least it's becoming cheaper quite imminently. So it requires, I think, more of a political economic argument than an economic argument. We know there's entrenched interest in many countries that have political connections in kind of many of the traditional fossil fuel sectors. So it just requires a lot of strategy and to surpass those. But ultimately, I think the trend is inexorable, and the quicker that ASEAN economies move there, the better. I think Vietnam has been a good success story on that front. I think in the last year, if I'm not mistaken, Vietnam alone put in more renewable power capacity than the rest of the region combined. I have to double check the latest numbers. And a lot of that is coming from FDI sources. So there's a ton of foreign capital that wants to invest in this space, but the regulatory regimes tend to lag a little bit. So I think the quicker, the better, and ultimately it will be in economic interest as well.
Do you want to jump in?
Yeah, I just wanted to add, actually, I totally agree with whatever Dr. Mate and Joseph has said. In fact, actually, Joseph is quite right. 2 years ago, in a report, we were highlighting why don't we actually move towards a green economy, sort of like, why don't we give up fossil fuels? Of course, there are vested interests in it. But one of the ways I think everybody misses out of how to move towards a more sustainable economy, right? ESG along the lines of being more inclusive and green, is the role that consumers can play actually in this entire thing. Because if you have these consumers who are basically being activists, right? We are not going to buy things from companies that are not green and they don't actually incorporate ESG. I think that's a trend you're finding. Actually, a lot of things are happening. So businesses will be forced into incorporating ESG sooner than they probably had thought. So that's one thing. And I think consumers are also becoming a little bit more enlightened about the impact that their actions have. So they're becoming a little bit more sustainable. I would have thought that they would become more after the pandemic, knowing that we can survive on very little. We don't need that much, but they're not that enlightened yet. But still, I think a lot of that is going to play out in the coming years as well. One point now it completely slipped actually. Besides, I had another point to make, but I'll probably, if we'll come back, I'll get back to you.
When you remember it, please just come back in with it. Andrew.
Yeah, no, I agree completely with what has just been said. And just to put it into a bit of context, there was a Bloomberg article, I think it was 2 days ago, where they said that they predict that ESG assets worldwide will hit about 50 trillion by 2025, which is almost a third of global AUM, and they're not the only ones. There's lots of predictions, which I think are just just an indication of the top of mind importance that ESG is playing. But what I would say, though, is there's been a huge focus, rightly, certainly, this is very important, on climate change and environmental issues. But ESG is much more broader than that. What the gold industry is particularly aware of those broader issues, as similar with other extractive industries, where you have all sorts of corporate governance issues, labor rights issues, conflict, minerals, and so on, that form part of the broader canon of ESG considerations. But what's happening at the moment, I think that there's a number of things. One is you've got this increased consumer interest and regulatory interest and government interest. Part of the catalyst was a focus on climate change, but the broader focus now is ESG more broadly. But that plus now we've got technological change, which is actually bringing a number of things to industry more broadly, but financial services in particular, and that's the ability to trace material through the supply chain in a much more granular way. I mean, an industry that really leads on this is the food industry and the pharma industries, because if you have those public health priorities, so if you buy a burger, you could in theory find out which animal or which farm the materials came from and so on. And likewise with pharma, every single vial of vaccine or a tray of tablets, exactly who's produced it, which batch it came from, where the raw materials were sourced, and the regulatory treatment of that and so on, and where it's been. And the technology allows us now to apply that similar kind of tracking to broader supply chains. So you've got this sort of these dual positive pressures, really. One is that increased regulatory and consumer interest in ESG, but then also now we've got the technology to provide much more transparency to supply chains, and that I think means that we can't or companies and businesses won't be able to greenwash in the way that they have in the past, because the technology is now existing or at a level where it can't be ignored, or it can't be hidden. I think the final piece of the jigsaw, though, is on the regulatory side. There's a lot of talk about taxonomy when it comes to ESG. There's been lots of industry work, certainly in the gold industry, which we've led with the gold mines, trying to harmonize ESG reporting and so on. But I think the next stage really is the regulators to start imposing standards when it comes to ESG reporting in terms of the data granularity to supply chains, and the auditing around the data and the management of the data as well. I think that's the final piece of the jigsaw, which will be falling into place soon.
I must say, actually, I think ASEAN's actually doing quite a good job on taxonomies. They had their own taxonomy come out last November. Singapore's got one, Indonesia's got one, Philippines and Thailand are bringing out ones as well. So a lot of work being done on sustainable finance, and not just on the environment part of that, but the other elements as well. Sweta, you had your finger up.
I remembered, one of the senior moments I'm having, I forgot actually what I wanted to say. Anyways, so another thing that following up on what Joseph was saying, I mean, like vested interest, sometimes it's not even vested interest. Sometimes governments have not been able to tackle climate change because they're not working in a more holistic manner. Like I think climate change is only meant for like sort of one industry, one ministry, which is basically environment industry, not making, looking at the holistic picture. So one of the recent developments is, and Indonesia definitely among the ASEAN countries I know is a member of this, there's something called Coalition of Finance Ministers for Climate Change. And Finance Minister Sri Mulyani is actually a co-chair of that for that period of 2021 to 23. And I think there she can actually help push this whole idea of making it more comprehensive and how to make fiscal policy more climate friendly, sort of, so that's another tool you have.
Please.
Yeah, I mean, one thing that I note, for instance, in the response to the COVID, or it may be even on climate change, on the one hand, one must recognize the efficiency by which ASEAN member states have collectively responded formally in terms of various coordinated action and plans and etc. But sometimes one see some gaps emerging between expression of commitment at the regional level or even at the global level even more, and to what extent they are actually mainstreamed into national level decisions. For instance, by way of illustration, on the easing of travel, for instance, as different economies in ASEAN countries see signs of easing of the COVID situation. Most of the steps have been taken in a unilateral national way, and there isn't really much coordinated promotion of uniformity of response and network. For instance, in the case of Indonesia and Singapore, we have a VTL that is now a vaccinated travel lane or travel lane that is now still unilateral from Singapore for Indonesians to come to Singapore, that is being extended by Singapore. But it is only one way, a unilateral policy adopted by Singapore. There isn't a concurrent, to make it whole, Indonesia's similar response to Singapore. Likewise, a few days ago, Indonesia announced the so-called travel bubble for Singaporeans to visit the Riau Islands, Batam and Bintan. Again, that was a unilateral Indonesian government's announcement that's yet to be fully, made whole in terms of bilateral agreement, let alone regional agreement. So, this becomes this gap between intentions at the regional level and all the wonderful commitments made at the regional level, but to what extent are they instructing national governments in the way they take decisions, or are they in the end ultimately still taking decisions based on very much as they would in terms of national governments from their own from their own prism. So I believe that there is still room. The ASEAN economies, as others have said, is now showing signs of recovery, etc. But things, in my view, could be even more positive if only the regional level potentials and opportunity is fully utilized. Because at the moment, it's more on paper commitments and declarations of intent, but challenge in terms of mainstreaming to the national level. And by the way, Indonesia this year is a chair of the G20, and of course next year chair of ASEAN. Very rare to have such a back-to-back opportunity, which would be a fantastic opportunity for someone to be thinking in a cohesive and coherent way to promote something that you start, taking off from this year on to the next year, rather than be simply be efficient host, but more and less in terms of policy impact. Yeah, thank you.
I think you've just answered a question which I was going to ask you towards the end, which was, do you think that ASEAN can really show a collective political will to act truly collectively for the greater good and ensure sustainable economic recovery across the region? But I think you just answered that, but if you didn't, do you want to try again?
Exactly as I was saying just now, essentially, on paper, we are ASEAN economies, ASEAN member states are saying all the right thing in terms of recognizing that there must be greater policy coordination, etc. But the question is, to what extent that ultimately these things matter in the way national governments actually take decisions? Does it ever come into play in terms of decision-making process? And in the past, what I know is that normally the foreign ministries of the ASEAN capitals would be the agency, the agent that would remind that we need to invoke, or we can invoke these various facilities. But most governments now, their preoccupations are first and foremost national, and that is how nature of politics is, and it is how it is. But hopefully, there can be greater synergy between the national and the regional. Yeah.
I've always said ASEAN's not short of ideas; it's implementing them has always been the problem. The ideas are often great. Okay, there's one question in the chat which I'm going to ask, and I'm going to ask all of you to try and respond to, and it says, can the panel please discuss the issue about the increase in income inequalities across the region driven by COVID-19, and how do we go about trying to correct that? I'm going to look at Sweta first for this one, I think.
Okay. So COVID actually did. I mean, like, just to put it in perspective, inequalities had been rising actually for a while in this region, but I think they have been masked by high economic growth of the region and even the sub-region, so to speak, right? So people didn't care much about it. But I think a little bit of the focus on inequality has come in since the global financial crisis, partly because ever since the GFC, growth has slowed in the region, despite being the fastest growing region actually in the world. So COVID actually has brought a lot of these inequalities. It was just brought right into our face, basically. It's not that we didn't know these things existed, right? We knew that we have informal workers, we have, who don't have any social security. There's so many people. There's a big digital divide. People don't have access to the internet. And given that schools were locked down, kids had to actually do all this schooling online. And about, I think, somewhere around 230 million kids in this region, Asia Pacific. I'm not talking about ASEAN, but have actually been left out of education actually because of not having access to these online courses and stuff. So how do we build going forward? I mean, like, an inclusive thing, which is something Dr. Marty actually had brought this up at the beginning as well, right? And what we are trying to do actually, just to give you, log in on March 29th when we're gonna launch our survey, but we're looking at some of the fiscal policies and what to do there, basically. So we are going a little bit, yes, it's easier to say spend your way out, but you know what, countries are actually constrained right now. They don't have that much fiscal room to speak. So what do you do? Just saying efficiency, like, just spend on education, that's also probably not necessarily the only solution they have. So what we're drilling down a little bit in right now, and I don't have exact policies, but like, even if you want to sort of close the gap by having an educated workforce, because we know that's going to improve the job prospects of people going forward, which is going to close the inequality gap. Is it tertiary education you should be spending on, or is it primary and secondary? In fact, actually, some of our initial stuff that we've looked at actually tries to show that spending a lot more on tertiary education would basically increase inequality rather than decrease. So, you've got to actually literally, and it actually is up to every country to look exactly which are the spendings that have helped reduce inequality rather than actually increase it. So that's one place. But another one, we are kind of actually being a little bit more provocative, is to ask, can central banks help tackle this inclusive development a little bit more than their traditional roles of just focusing on price stability and stuff like that? Because financial inclusion is a part of a lot of central banks, mandates. Can they actually do more? And should they and can they do more? And that's another question. So there are lots of different ways that we can think of trying to build an inclusive recovery going forward and inclusive development, but that requires a lot of foresight and a lot of political will. I'm not going to deny on that one, and maybe Dr. Marty could actually tell us how hard it is to actually do these things.
Thank you. Joseph.
Yeah, I think Dr. Seta brings up a good point about, who is responsible for enacting these policies. For example, central banks in ASEAN have been tasked with a lot over the last 2-3 years, right? It went from price stability and employment to actually financing the government in most countries. I think that she's right. They have a role to play in financial development, financial inclusion, creating the right ecosystem, because especially in Philippines and Indonesia, you really have very low banking penetration. You can increase that. It really goes a long way in boosting development. But ultimately, it has to be fiscal policy. It has to be very smart fiscal policy. No longer just a simple counter-cyclical stimulus and cash transfers and wage subsidies, but really tackle the development crisis that's unfolded in the last few years. Because we know that it's really, in terms of simple education, right? Primary, secondary, in a lot of countries, particularly in the rural areas, it's really fallen off the cliff. I mean, reading some NGOs that really work in parts of rural Indonesia and the Philippines, from what I gather, there is actually a crisis in education because of COVID, right? Because simply there wasn't the resources to shift online. So there's a disruption to classrooms. I mean, that's what eats into long-term, in addition to the crisis for development, it really eats into long-term economic growth as well, because that's your kind of soft infrastructure. So I think we should see, the shift in fiscal policy, and that's also why it's important not to kind of withdraw that fiscal support too quickly. And I think governments really do get that. The budgets that have been put forward, you do see this shift happening. And I think, fortunately, yes, the Fed's tightening is a risk for ASEAN, but because the macroeconomic fundamentals are still pretty strong, current account deficits have moderated where they existed, reserves levels are strong. So I am confident that we can keep kind of enough policy support there without jeopardizing financial stability. And that's ultimately a testament to pretty good economic management.
Thank you. We're almost at the end, so I'm going to quickly go around with one final question to each of you in turn. And Joseph, as you just finished, I'll come to you straight away with it. What do you think are the three major economic challenges facing the region for this year?
Three economic challenges. Yeah, look, I mean, the first one will still definitely be the Fed's tightening the raise in interest rates. Even if fundamentals are strong, it still does require pretty deft, macroeconomic management. So we'll need to see the right policies, governments really commit to reforms, to opening up. The other one would still be political, I think. We need to see more stable political cycles in the region, kind of longer term commitment to reforms still is probably the best way for longer run development. And of course, you have to mention COVID, like it's been mentioned on the call many times. Ultimately, I'm still pretty confident that, and like we've looked at, a lot of the studies from people that know infectious diseases much better, but historically these tend to get less virulent or at least less severe as we go on. So I'm confident that we can withstand the further wave, but of course, COVID has to be up on the list.
Thank you, Joseph. Dr. Suela, for you, what do you think some of the emerging macroeconomic trends are that businesses need to look out for in the region?
Actually, so I think some of the trends, I think not just for this sub-region, I think in general, people have to look for is this whole activism, for ESG that's going on around the world. And I think this region is catching up a little bit as well, basically, and probably the sub-region. Because I was reading about how there was articles about like, Asian CEOs make more money than American CEOs, right? I mean, like all just the spotlight being actually, shining on some of these rich people, basically. So some of these kind of things businesses need to be a little bit aware of, that which way the wind is blowing. And as I had said earlier, a lot of activism you're going to find. But one thing I do feel that what businesses need to actually be think about is, I keep saying that people need to have this change in mindset about profit, like, a shareholder economy versus a purpose economy, which is a stakeholder economy, sort of. And this conversation, I've been thinking of it for a really long time, but 2 years ago, it got changed a little bit when the Business Roundtable in 2019 came out with this saying, we'll move away from this, right? It's more about actually, for businesses, they really need to think about what is their purpose for doing business here. If they're looking to move into ESG, because and some studies come out saying, ESG index funds were actually performing much better than the other ones. And I mean, if it's the bottom line is always going to be your profit, actually, and it's not going to change much. So they really have to move a little bit. And when I say they have to move towards purpose, not to say that they are going to be incurring losses, actually. It's not about that, because business cannot stay in business with losses. So profits, but how much of profits do they need? So this has to be a shift in a little bit of mindset of these guys as well. What are they working for? At least enlightened view that they should have of, let's move from profit to, purpose, profit with purpose. That kind of attitude. So that they should be look out. And there's a lot of activism going on around the world. So.
Thank you. Andrew, my last question for you is, how do you foresee changing geopolitical situations impacting on the investment outlook for the region?
Well, yeah, I mean, for sure, definitely have will definitely have an impact. And that was one of the factors that we discussed when we were thinking about the economic outlook. I mean, it's certainly going to impact the macroeconomic situation, I think, but the longer term geopolitical pressures, I think, is going back to this, or the bigger impact, I think, will be on this supply chain issue and supply chain diversification, the regionalization of economies. It's ironic that we started with sort of national economies clubbing together to create regional economies with the view to have a sort of, it's perhaps a bit naive, but a global free trading system with complete interoperability and no barriers and so on. But actually, we're moving one step down in terms of ambitions now, I think, back to this regionalization. But as I said before, I don't think it's necessarily because of a traditional form of protectionism. It's different now. The debate's moved on. It's not about sort of protecting local employment or local industry, although many governments still want to do that. But the actual priority now is protecting access to secure supply chains and strategic goods and so on, and actually having just like you'd want to diversify an investment portfolio, perhaps with gold. So I had to get that plug in, but you might want to diversify your supply chains by having alternative sources of supply, so you're not over reliant on a particular producer. Final point I just wanted to make, if you don't mind me changing tack slightly, but just going back to the question about what the biggest or what government should be doing. In my view, it's focusing on digital infrastructure. I really think that this could it would help solve a number of issues. First of all, it would support financial inclusion, which is key, as Dr. Sweater mentioned, key to overcoming inequalities and so on. But it also helps with increasing access to education. I mean, one of the positives of COVID, if there is one, I mean, I like to think that we always have to find a positive in something, one of which has actually been a greater comfort with using digital technologies, and actually this is bringing the world closer. And I think it could be potentially revolutionary in terms of increasing access to information, increasing access to education, formalizing economies and so on, and that really is key to development and tackling inequalities, just to go back to one of your earlier questions.
Thanks, Andrew. And Your Excellency, last one comes to you before I do a very quick fire question at the end to all of you. How do you think ASEAN could leverage its external relationships to help with economic recovery? And in answering that, what more can it do to promote brand ASEAN perhaps to the rest of the world?
Well, I think first and foremost, like I was trying to suggest earlier, ASEAN must make relevant and operational the various commitments that it has made, for instance, on a coordinated response on COVID. While on paper, they are all marvelous and quite positive undertaking or commitments, we really need to ensure that they actually matter. And when it comes to actual policy formulation, that there is an agency within the decision-making process in each ASEAN capital that would need to remind that there is actually a regional level approach that must be fully utilized. Only if ASEAN is seen to be delivering on its own commitments would third parties have respect and confidence of its capacity. And in this regard, I think it is extremely important for ASEAN to be seen to be acting as one. And as you know, in recent months, this has been a very challenging period for ASEAN because of developments within its member state in Myanmar, specifically, where we are seeing evidence of fragmentation within ASEAN, and this can't be good for the region as a whole. So having demonstration of relevance within their own capitals and projecting unity externally, extremely important. And whether it be in Europe or elsewhere, the so-called brand ASEAN is extremely important to continue to nurture and protect. But I'm afraid at the moment, given developments, for instance, in Myanmar, when one thinks of ASEAN in some quarters, is that type of imagery that comes to mind. But it doesn't have to be that way. We can continue to press on with the type of efforts that have been made in the past. Just one final point, I wanted to end by what I began with at the beginning, that it is critically important when we look at the prospect for ASEAN economies in the future and to always mainstream the notion of inclusive economic recovery. I think because this won't happen by itself, there has to be some kind of a concerted efforts in that regard. Back in 98, 99, when Indonesia gone through multi-layered convulsion, political, security, financial, economic, the most resilient economic sector in Indonesia at the time was actually the informal sector. The small and medium enterprises proved their resilience, and whilst others around it in the economy collapsed, they were able to sustain. But this time around, the COVID's impact have been especially devastating for the most vulnerable. You are seeing potential generational loss in terms of educational opportunities, the health welfare of children whose other regular vaccinations have been delayed because all resources have been put into eradicating COVID. These are things that the full impact may only be known in years to come. And I hope governments and the private sector can find a way of always including in their conversation this notion of inclusive growth. And it is not simply because it's right. Of course, one must do the right thing. But I think given all the recent preoccupation with ESG and the like, it can actually be financially rewarding as well to bring everyone in a better way. So that's how I feel anyway. Thank you very much indeed. Thank you.
Thank you. I agree 100% with all you just said. And of course, this year's theme for Cambodia's chairmanship is addressing challenges together. Let's see how much the together bit is coming out true. Right, final question, and you get 2-word answers to this question. Year of the Tiger, roaring success, or a sleeping cat? Joseph.
Choose between those two.
Yes, please. Or if you go with a third one, roaring success. Great. Sweater.
If those are the options.
You're on mute.
Roaring tiger. No, what did you say?
Roaring success or sleeping cat?
Roaring success.
Andrew.
Well, given how disappointing last year was, roaring success.
And lastly, Dr. Marty.
Yes, roaring success with the occasional yawn.
Thank you very much, all 4 of you, for a stimulating debate. I could have carried on for longer, but thank you for joining us today. I hope the audience enjoyed it. The recording will be out at some point. Inclusive growth, profit with a purpose, ESG to the fore, getting countries to work better together in the region. And I really hope that 2-way VTL comes with Indonesia, because I'm missing going to Jakarta. And let's all hope we don't end up by the end of the year talking about an Amiga variant. Thank you all very much. Joseph, you can go back to bed now. Enjoy the rest of your day and keep safe and keep well. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Everybody, thank you.